Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to the Open House Show. It's Jesse Meadow, your host. Today and this week, actually, we're going to be talking about reopening plans for some schools, and we're also going to be talking about remote learning, the challenges and successes that go along with that, how to keep students engaged. We have a great guest, Kristen Mariotti. She's the assistant head of school for Enrollment and Strategy at the Stoneleigh Burnham School up in Massachusetts. We also have my partner in crime, Chris Mitchell, joining us as well. So let's bring them on without further ado and get the show started. Hey, Kristen. Hey, Chris. How are you?
Hey, great to see you.
Good afternoon.
Hey, Chris.
Excellent. Well, we'll jump right into it, Kristen. We'll start off with you. Tell us a little bit, about your, how long you've been in admissions, what excites you about the job, and then kind of how you got to Stoneleigh Burnham.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys both for having me. This is such a pleasure to see you and to connect in this way. I've been doing admissions for pretty much my whole career. I just entered my 21st year in admissions. I started off back in the day. My first jobs were in universities and colleges, and then I got drawn to the boarding school world and have been there ever since. I have been at Stoneleigh Burnham. I just entered my third year as the assistant head for enrollment, and I think what excites me the most about this field is the work we get to do with families, the way we get to guide families through the process, help them find a great fit school. And, sometimes that's not your school, but usually we try to find ways to attract families to see the benefits of our school. And I think that interpersonal connection with students and with their parents is probably the most exciting and fun part for me. Of course, in the midst of a pandemic and this challenging year, we've had so much less of that. And I think that interpersonal connection is really missing in some ways, though we've been able to replicate in some ways virtually with our events and other things. But I think the working with families and seeing a student find the right fit and really be successful at the school has been the most exciting thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's so true, especially when you talk about, I remember when I was dealing with admissions, you bring this family and you give them the tour, they're brand new, they learn the school, then they get there, and then, they come in multiple years. You see this child grow, you see the family grow, and it's just a big part of that. And you're right. This year, it's been tough trying to keep that personal relationship with all the safeguards in place, with the absence of big fairs or real personal tours. Everyone obviously has the virtual option that's going on. So it's definitely a different role. We were talking about that a little bit before the show. It's definitely a different role, and the things that you have to do now are going to be quite different. So tell me a little bit about Stoneleigh Burnham. What are some things that draw families to the school before we get into some of the remote learning stuff?
Yes, well, thanks. I think I want to start by saying what drew me to the school, because I think it really is similar to what draws our families in. It's really the community, and not just because it's a small community, not because it's an all-girls community, although those things are really important, but the actual closeness of our students and our faculty and staff is just something that really set the school apart for me. When I went in for an interview for the position, I was just really, really blown away by how connected the students are to one another and to their teachers. And that does have a lot to do with the size of the school. We are about 150 students, and that's grades 7 through 12. So everyone knows each other. It's very hard to fall through the cracks in a school like ours. We really get to know the girls and, help them become successful in whatever the, best version of themselves might be. Some of the things that attract students and families to our school is certainly that we are a school for girls. So there are families that might be looking specifically for that, both domestic and international families. That might be an appeal. Our location's incredible. We're in beautiful Western Massachusetts in the Pioneer Valley. So it's a suburban area. We do have access to some cities and the 5 colleges in Amherst and Northampton, Massachusetts. So there's a lot of opportunity for connection with other educational institutions. Also quite a few boarding schools in this area, as you know. So there are a lot of options for our students to interact with other boarding schools and other members of those communities. Definitely the small size, as I mentioned, is something that some families are really interested in, because they are really dedicated to finding a school for their daughter where they'll be known and heard and seen every day. And then we have some signature programs that I think a lot of people probably find us by doing their searches online. We're pretty well known for our equestrian program, internationally recognized program that also has the British Horse Society certification, which we're the only school, secondary school in the United States that can offer that certification. We also have a pretty well recognized debate and public speaking program, as well as really strong fine arts and performing arts. And we also have the International Baccalaureate. So if you're looking at how families find us and they're doing a search, those are some of the things that would really draw them to us. But all of those programs are central to our mission of being a school that's globally minded and dedicated to helping girls find their voices and, knowing that they'll be heard.
I think that's one of the things that I love about independent schools is just the uniqueness that each school kind of has. They have their own kind of story and narrative. They all service the same aspect of building well-rounded students, the education factor. But it's great talking to schools across the country where each one kind of has their uniqueness, and that's one of the special things I think about independent schools for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah. So, Kristen, take us back. We're in March, COVID hits, spring break, everyone's scrambling. What are we going to do? How long-term is this going to look?
Right.
We're implementing plans. What were some of the initial reactions? How were you guys able to, adapt really to what was going on with your students? You're a boarding school, you had an international component, I'm sure. How did that work for you guys?
Yeah, wow, this feels like it was, 10 years ago now.
Lifetime, right?
I know, it really is. We're really ready for this to
Yes.
be over for sure. Yeah, really good question. Fortunately, in some ways, Stoneleigh Burnham School was on spring break when everything had to close down. So a lot of the schools in our area were back from spring break or had not left on spring break yet, which I guess would be also a positive. But some of our schools had just come back from spring break and had to basically shut down and send their students home. And it was really challenging. So we were really fortunate that we were on spring break when we started seeing the federal and the local shutdown happen. And we were able to just tell our students that you're going to just stay on spring break. And we actually gave them an additional week of spring break because we needed to figure out how we were going to teach them remotely, all of them, all 150 students. So that was not something we were fully prepared for at the time, as most schools weren't. And I am so impressed by what our faculty and our tech department was able to put together for a really robust, really mission-centered, girl-centered program for the rest of the year. We used Google Classroom because we had already used that on our on campus. Our students would get their assignments through Google Classroom. But what we realized, and we kind of knew this to be true, is that our students in some parts of the world, especially China, were unable to access a lot of the Google platforms because there's restrictions in China for that. So my tech director actually, with my marketing director, who's really good at building websites, created a separate platform for our international students so that they could actually access all of the, basically a replica of the Google Classroom platform for the remainder of the year. It's not an ideal situation, but we had to do something quickly for a very large portion of our students. About 30% of our students are international. So we wanted to make sure there was equity in how we were serving all of our students. We got through graduation, which was totally virtual. Some of the end of the year traditions that we really, really treasure had to all be done virtually. So it was tough. The seniors were emotional, as you can imagine. A senior year like that, I can't even imagine what that was like for them. And then we were able really in the summer to think about, if we need to stay remote, what kinds of platforms are we going to use? What's going to best serve all of our students? And we ended up partnering with One Schoolhouse, and we use the Canvas platform now. And we were one of the first schools and only schools really in this region who decided to be remote for the entire fall. So we have not been back to school on campus yet.
That's interesting. I mean, that gives you guys a long runway of dealing with this remote learning. I remember the end of school, we were lucky enough to be like, I think we were 1 week before spring break where we made the call, so they were able to go home and pack and be prepared to maybe not come back. At the time, we didn't know. Florida, obviously very different from Massachusetts and some of the others. It's a little bit of the Wild West here, where you can kind of pick and choose what you want to do, and just kind of follow the federal regulations. But in that regard, it was, you look around, you see the end of the year, and it was so emotional. And but what was the drive-through graduations, where like everyone comes with the parades and they're coming through, and so many unique things. It was the beginning of being the creative minds of school administrators of how do we make this experience still good for them. I think they did a very good job with that. And to your point, you made the decision ahead of time. We're going to commit. We're going all virtual for the fall. How did that work out? Tell me some successes, some things that kind of led you to that decision, but also by doing that, there's probably a lot of things that worked out well for you. That, Canvas is a great program. Many universities use it, so it's a good transition for them. How did all that work for you guys?
Yeah, I think there were, overwhelmingly our families were relieved to have a plan. So we announced in June. Early. I mean, there are some schools that announced in August or late July what the plan was for the fall. And I think having a plan in place early allowed our families to decide if, to feel comfortable and feel like their child was going to be taken care of regardless, or make a decision if they didn't want a remote option to transfer. And we did lose a couple students because of this, and that's to be expected. We do hope that they'll return. Most of the students that said they were going to defer are students that are committed to our school and really just didn't see remote as being a great option for them just because of their learning styles. But overwhelmingly, our families, especially our international families, were grateful that we made a decision based on science, based on the recommendations, based on the safety and first and foremost of their students, their children. So that was great. So that was a success. We did not lose very many families. They felt very committed to us. We do have a community of students. Once you're part of the community, it's people just love the school, and we're lucky that we have current families that are just so dedicated and so supportive of the school. We were able to really master online learning, and our teachers are brilliant, and they have been able to, it's probably not the summer that they were expecting to have, but they did spend a lot of time doing training on Canvas and in some of the One Schoolhouse trainings, and really have become experts in this way. Even teachers that thought, I'll never be able to do this online, are feeling very empowered by this. And I think that's incredible. So that was a win for us. Overwhelmingly, our students, though they'd mostly rather be on campus with us, are saying that the online experience has been incredibly user-friendly, and they feel engaged. We're doing a lot of synchronous and asynchronous work. We still are having house meeting every week as a group on a Zoom call. So the entire community, teachers, faculty, staff, and students are coming in and meeting and sharing time like we would in a normal scenario in our big Capon room, which is our conference room area. Some of the other things I think have been really successful for us are just the ways the admissions team has had to think about recruitment and think about, so this is more of like from an admissions perspective, but what are we doing that we can take on into a post-COVID world that has been successful and that could still support our mission as an admissions team? And some of our virtual events have been, very well attended from students from all over the world because they don't have to get on a plane and fly here from Asia or Europe or Latin America, and they can get to know our school. And so I think we've become more accessible in that way. And that's something that I think we need to keep at least some degree of virtual interaction for families, because we can't rely on this come to campus open house stuff anymore. We have to really look at other ways to attract more folks. Yeah.
So I'm curious, obviously there's a lot of components that make independent schools unique, right? And so how have you been able, and your team been able to keep the students engaged, right? Engaged in kind of the culture of the school. and it's a very sterile interaction, through Zoom and through learning platforms. And so, what have you guys talked about, implemented, some good results, some things that didn't work? I mean, I'm interested to hear what those are.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one of the really interesting things about this is that we actually had to start thinking about these things before we were even recruiting for this cycle, because we actually enrolled a bunch of students after we went remote, or like right around the time we went remote last March. And they were new students that had maybe been to campus once or had never been to campus because we were closed to the public in the spring. So we actually had to retain a large handful of students that we enrolled post-pandemic. And that was a challenge. So we started kind of working on those things and connecting those students with current students, and doing kind of Zoom meetups and things like that with the head of the middle school, with the head of the upper school. So we did some like informal kind of coffee chats with parents. What we've done this year as a recruiting, during this recruiting cycle for next year, is really implemented the things we learned in the spring, and things that weren't successful and some that were. We realized that a webinar, when we're just speaking at people for, an hour and a half, is probably not going to be as meaningful to a family as if they can see each other and maybe interact. So we've had to make some of those adjustments as time has gone by. But we actually, back to the spring, we had our full revisit day. Our huge yield event was completely remote, and it was amazing. We had more families at the revisit day than we've had in like 10 years, because they were able to attend, being that it was virtual. And we had breakout rooms, and our families were engaged in house meeting, like I mentioned before, which is really interactive. And so I think those kinds of things, as much as we can bring our prospective families into what we're already doing to keep our current students engaged, and in the focus that we have on our current student social and emotional growth, as much as we can bring our perspectives into seeing that, I think that's really been successful for us. During our house meeting, students do like chat waterfalls. So welcome families and hi. And then our visiting families actually also see how supportive our students are to one another. And I think that's really making them feel a connection, and really understanding the ethos of Stoneleigh Burnham. One of our brand new international students has never seen the campus. She's from Shanghai. She's never seen the campus. She was accepted. She took the offer, has joined us totally remotely, and she sent a piano piece to see if we would want to use it or like play it in the house meeting for our virtual visit day. And the support she got from our current students was just unbelievable. None of these kids even really know this student yet. They've only seen her on a Zoom screen, and it was like, Veronica, you're amazing. That's amazing. Beautiful. And so I think, our visiting families are really seeing the kind of community we are. And I think, just to make a long story short, as much personal connection you can draw, that it's already happening organically in your schools, and as much of that as you can kind of let the visiting families bear witness to, I think is really important.
Well, if there's any generation of students that can adapt to usage of technology and building connections through technology, this is definitely that generation. Yeah. So that seems to be the tone around the country is, students are more adaptive and going along than even some of the administration and the schools trying to figure this out. They have adapted really well to this. So that's good to hear.
Yes.
It's been really interesting to see how everyone's playing, those open houses or those virtual events. Like they've had good opportunities to make it personal in ways that they might not have before, because everyone was working. They could do different times. They have the breakout sessions. They bring in the students. There's more of a need to make it personal because they're not there. So they start calling on all these different personnels on campus to give it that personal feel, and not make it, like you said, just that talking, directly to them. And then that's the end of the show kind of thing, right. They make them involved in some manner. Also, what I've been hearing, and we talked with several schools already, and through some of our clients, they have a lot of word of mouth advertisements. They bring on families, they bring on parents, they bring on students, and they talk about their experience. experience
Right.
directly to them in those environments, which is, it's a nice touch to have, including if it's just virtual,
Right.
It's good. Some of those things I think are here to stay. I find it interesting though. I haven't heard yet, and I didn't think about this, but I hadn't heard yet about a student that's newly enrolled, but because of everything hadn't been to the campus. They're still dealing with, I imagine that's a common thing in college. They get enrolled. A lot of the freshmen, they are not able to be on campus, or maybe they were in some sort of isolated situation, really not getting that experience, but they're still feeling the connection to the school and to the campus. And then I'm sure the response from the current students made that student at Shanghai. I mean, I'm sure she was elated from that response.
Yeah.
So the time will come, obviously, when we open back up and COVID is a thing of the past, right? And we can look back on 2020 as the year we all want to forget, right? But what do you think will stay? What do you think of either technology or things that have been implemented? What do you think's here for the long haul because of what happened with COVID?
It's a really good question. So I was in, I don't know if it was like a webinar or something. I was in, one of the speakers recently with one of our regional admissions groups said, you're crazy if you think that COVID is ever really going away. And I think, yes, we're going to have a vaccine, hopefully sooner rather than later. But we're still going to have potential, especially in the next few years while we figure all of this out. There's still going to be a potential for things to have to kind of shut down for a little while and open back up, and schools might be back and forth with hybrid. I would say that schools really, really should consider having some kind of remote option for students, regardless of what the future looks like. I think we have to embrace that this has been something that has drawn students to us. I have students that have found us because we're remote. I'm hoping they're going to stay when we're not remote anymore. But if a school can manage with staffing and with the technology to have that option, this could be a real huge benefit for schools moving forward, especially as enrollments are declining and the market is declining, to really be competitive in that space where you could have a traditional boarding school, but also if you want to join us from Brazil and you don't want to come to school here, but you want to do an online program, are there ways to do that? I'm not saying we have that figured out yet, but I really think it's an important thing to think about, because we're going to have something like that available just in case. So I think if schools are really able to capitalize on that, it could be really a good thing. That could also be for summer programs and things like that. And I do strongly feel that we have to continue to offer online events for recruiting. I mean, there's just no reason why we wouldn't do that. I'm not saying every single one has to be that anymore, but there has to be an option. At the very least, there has to be recordings of these events for students that can't attend. But I think this is something that my team and I have become pretty expert at this year. Although every time we have one, we meet and say, oh gosh, we have to do something different next time. So, again, continuing to grow as we do those things. But to have that option for students, I think is going to be critical moving forward. And it's really expanded our market, in a time where we really need a market. Right.
That's a huge conversation starter. I mean, you're talking about enrollment declining, generally speaking, every year before COVID. It wasn't COVID just exacerbated everything. It didn't really create much new things. What an interesting put to an extra revenue generator, and to be honest with you, we wouldn't have to recreate the wheel. I mean, the colleges do a lot of this. I'm not saying that we're at that level, we'll have that many students, but you just imagine a normal university and how many online students that they have. What kind of extra revenue did they create? And create a process. Obviously, it'll be a smaller number. You can make those community engagements to make them feel a little bit more part of it. Like you were talking about earlier. I mean, you really wouldn't have to recreate the wheel, especially after everyone that's done at least some sort of remote learning, whether they're full-time or not, this year, because they were kind of forced into it. But that's an excellent point to make on some extra revenue sources, especially since, my background's development, I can only imagine what advancement and development offices are having to deal with. And of course, how does that affect, operational budgets that a lot of schools are having to deal with? And so, it's kind of,
I think the schools and institutions that are able to adapt and think on their feet and see opportunity that weren't there before are going to have a lot of success when they come out of it.
Absolutely. I totally agree.
Yeah. So, Kristen, let's move forward a little bit. I know you said you were remote for the fall. There is plans for being back on campus in the spring?
There is. Yep.
Obviously there's a benefit to that. You've been able to see the successes and failures of some other reopenings, what worked, what didn't, definitely regionally, in your area. So how is that looking? What are some things you're taking that you're going to be implementing over there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you're right. We made a decision early, and we made a decision for our school, the size of our school, the number of international students that we have, the number of boarders. We also have a large day population. There were so many factors that went into Stoneleigh Burnham deciding that it was most responsible to stay remote, and we still totally feel that way. What's been really good for us is that, we have great relationships with our schools nearby, and we've been able to learn from them, like you said. They've been overwhelmingly successful, and no one's gotten really sick, and thank goodness there's not been anything major that has happened that was really had to shut anybody down. And that was, of course, what we wanted, was this to be a successful thing. But we've learned from some of their challenges too, just in terms of, space in the health center. There have been some outbreaks, students having to shut down class for a week for an entire grade because there was an outbreak in that pod or that grade, and how disruptive that was. And really one of our main goals was to not have this kind of start up and stop and start up and stop, or as my CFO said, toing and froing, students on and then off and then on, or, we really didn't have, we have so many students that live far away from our campus that the thought of having that, that process going all fall would have been really challenging. So we did learn a lot from our partner schools. They've shared a lot of resources with us about what they're using for, contact tracing and testing, and companies that they're using. So really, really collaborative group of New England schools out here, and we've been really grateful for that. Our plan is to bring our boarders back in mid-January and have them do an isolation quarantine for 2 weeks before we bring everybody else back, including domestic boarders. And I guess all boarders would come back in January. And then our day students would join hopefully the first week of February. But, again, we're going to keep an eye on federal and national guidelines and numbers and all of those things, because it could be that we have to wait a little longer. Definitely won't be coming back before mid-January though. And we've expanded our health center. We've gotten all the equipment we need, and the testing is all ordered. So there's arrows everywhere. You have to go one way through the building, and we have a pretty small physical plant. We have very large campus, but our actual buildings are pretty small and pretty narrow. It's an older school. So we've had to make some changes in classrooms so that we can keep students socially distanced. But yeah, we're so grateful to the schools in this area to really, to have folks to talk to about this process. What I do know is the teachers are exhausted at these schools that reopened, and our teachers are too, because teaching remotely for an entire semester or a semester and a half or 2 semesters.
Teaching's exhausting regardless, right? COVID, not COVID.
Exhausting regardless. And I think, something I said in another interview before was, we really didn't want to put our teachers in a position where they had to not only worry about providing an excellent education, but also the health and wellness and well-being of their students with regard to COVID. Of course, we're worried about their health and well-being always, but to have to also protect students against like a virus that is very dangerous was just something too much that we didn't want to put on the teachers. And I think it has taken a toll on some of the teachers that have gone back, especially I have friends that are public school teachers that are exhausted. This is a really, really hard time. So I think our teachers appreciated the time that they've had to be remote and are ready to come back, not without concern, but we feel very well prepared now.
Are you going to implement different, I guess, procedures or approach with your international population? Is it optional to come back? Is there going to be quarantining that happens? What steps are you guys taking for that population of students?
Yeah, great question. So, as I said, we're about 30% international. So it is an important population for us that we serve. At this point, we will be offering remote learning through the end of the year for any student that would like to continue on with that instead of returning to campus. So it'll be exactly as they've been receiving it now. It's just that there will be students. We've actually set up some cameras in classrooms, so it'll actually be pretty interactive, that they'll be kind of on campus. Most of our teachers are teaching from home right now, but anyone that stays remote will kind of get to see back into their classroom, and there'll be some videos and things set up. So yeah, we are absolutely offering a remote option. And some of our domestic boarders might actually take part in that as well. Just depends on comfort level. In terms of quarantining, all of our boarders will quarantine for 2 weeks when they return to campus. And then we will do testing to make sure that they are symptom free.
So are they quarantining together, or like a bubble, or are they quarantining individually?
So they're all going to quarantine in their own single dorm rooms on a dorm hall. So they will be eating meals and things like that in their rooms. They will have to wear masks and stay socially distanced outside of their rooms, but they'll all be in singles, which is actually not normally the case. Most of our rooms are doubles. So we will be having students in all singles. We've had to make some adjustments to make that possible for all of our students.
I guess one of the perks for boarding in the pandemic,
Get your own room.
It's true though. When you get the boarders on campus, you get everything, under control. Everyone's tested. Everyone's on the right track. You're ready to go, and then it's boom. The day student population. That's where it's like consistently day-to-day operations of trying to mitigate this and make sure it doesn't spread out of control, because you can control your bubble on campus.
Right.
It's just the minute they go outside and come back in, it's what happened in that meantime. Who did you interact with?
Right.
It complicates the whole thing. The day students. Not that we don't love day students.
No, we love them, but I think you're absolutely right, and that was part of the reason why Stoneleigh Burnham really couldn't really see opening up fully on campus, because a lot of the boarding schools in New England, as you know, are 80%, 85% boarding. There's this little handful of day students, and a lot of those boarding schools, almost all of their teachers, faculty, staff, everybody live on campus. So we are not like that. We are much more of a day and boarding school, where, this year we're half day, half boarding. That's a little bit lower than we're usually about a third day. But this year we don't have as many boarding students this year for obvious reasons, but to have that many boarding students, 50 or 55 day students rather, coming to campus every day, and their parents are working, and they're not, and then all of our teachers don't live on campus. So
right.
We only have a handful of house parents and a few teachers that live on campus. So we have a lot of our day faculty and staff coming back and forth. That's more challenging than, to me, than the boarding piece, because you can, like you said, really contain those kids in pods or whatever and make sure everyone's following guidelines, but we don't know what's happening. And you make a good point there. I just finished writing a community health pledge. And I think a lot of schools, this is something I learned, as you asked, what have I learned from the other schools? Most of the schools are doing this to basically say, I will abide by all these rules. I'll wear my mask. I'll socially distance. I will. And then there's one on there that's like, if I'm a day student and I'm off campus, I'm going to follow these rules too, and they have to sign this pledge. And then we also have a waiver that's basically saying, like, you are taking a risk by being here. And if you get COVID, you're saying that you're willing to take that risk, and that's a legal document that we'll be doing. So those are things that I wasn't even thinking about. Certainly not as an admissions director, but
no, definitely not. Usually that comes from somewhere else. It gets thrown on you. Hey, you need to make sure that the family fills this out.
Right. So we're all learning new skills this year. Sure.
A lot of the feedback we've gotten is students have been really good about this. I think that they've just been so excited to see their friends and to, get that camaraderie that they're lacking, that you don't get from technology. So Godspeed, but from what we hear, like, students are being very good about this.
Good. Oh, that's good.
Yeah, they seem to be they don't want the alternative.
Yeah.
Right.
And whatever it takes. And to be honest with you, we talked about it before, they're adaptable, including technology, whatever the case may be. Their whole life is adapting to change all the time. And wear a mask, not ideal. They're probably used to it by now. Yep. These kind of things in the schools that we've talked to, we haven't seen the disrespect to the rules in regards to COVID like you have with other things that they just don't agree with because they're adolescents.
Right.
So that's been good. That's been good when you're talking about managing, because at the end of the day, right now, that's the biggest concern of a school is managing, the effects of this. It's an actual health risk. So, that's like the priority number one for a school. So, that's going to be good. But, transitioning a little bit, we always like to talk about the region. And, I know very little about what's going on in Massachusetts. So, what are you seeing with enrollment there these days? How's it looking?
I think that, I think in general, the boarding schools in Massachusetts have seen a small decline in enrollment, but they're over this year just because of the pandemic. But typically, New England still remains a very, hot spot. It's where people want to go. It has a significant draw for boarding students. But like the rest of the nation, there's a decline in international interest. This is not helping. A pandemic's not helping. The political climate's not helping. The social and racial unrest in the country is not helping. And this is what our international families are seeing. So I think all the schools in this area are definitely seeing declines. I'll say that in Massachusetts and other New England states, maybe not Massachusetts. Massachusetts had some pretty high numbers because we have major cities like Boston.
Right.
But like in Greenfield, we've had very, very low numbers. Deerfield, where Deerfield Academy is, which is our neighbor, very low numbers. So in our region, right here in the Pioneer Valley, we've had very low COVID cases. And most of them have been, because there's some nursing homes and things like that around here. So that's really where we've seen some spikes. And then for our friends in the boarding schools up in Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine, man, they've had some low numbers. And I know things are kind of spiking everywhere right now, but over the course of this pandemic, some of those little towns and little villages up in the northern part of New England have just been such a safe space for families to send their kids. And I feel like they've actually seen an increase in interest in some of those areas where it's like, I'll send my kid to the woods of New Hampshire and there's no COVID up there. They're going to be on a campus with all these rolling hills and there's no cities nearby. And so I think that some of that is a benefit to boarding schools in New England and some of the more rural boarding schools in New England. Right. Sure. Definitely. And, for us, and for some of the boarding schools in this area, I think they've seen some increased interest in day students because the public schools have just been so challenged by this remote learning. And a lot of our public schools have not gone back yet. Also, we are not, we're still remote, but we're doing a really great job with it. So we've actually, seen some interest from some of these students are like, well, if I have to do it remote, maybe I should think about a school that's doing it really well. Or if my school is going to be remote and it's not working for me, maybe I need to start looking at a day option at a private school. So I think there are families that might be looking at private school earlier than they might have, or maybe they wouldn't have at all because they haven't really had a great experience. And this is not to criticize the public schools at all, but I think with the amount of students in some of these public schools, some kids are just not really getting the service that they need. So, so I think there's potential here. I also worry about the international numbers for a lot of the schools in New England and basically all boarding schools because we are very dependent on attracting students from all over the world. I think that's really what it comes down to, and I think some of the smaller schools are feeling that push a little bit with that rapid decline.
Out of curiosity, obviously COVID in the last year has just sucked all the oxygen out, right? But when COVID goes away, vaccines, we get back to some level of normalcy. The issues that have plagued this, K through 12 or, particularly boarding schools, are still going to be there, right? And so, as we turn the page on this decade and we go into the next 10 years, how are schools, in your opinion, kind of re-looking at international boarding and domestic boarding, some of the challenges, branding it, you've got a new generation of parents, Jesse and I talk about this all the time, personally and with our clients about who your audience, at the end of Gen Xers, millennials, now even some Gen Zs, what is, if they're not legacies to boarding schools, how do we tell them and the benefits of that type of education and experience? And I'd just love to kind of hear your insight on like, where are we going? Like, how do we make sure that, something that Jesse and I and countless others benefit from are still going to be there in 10, 20, 30 years?
That's a really good question and a hard question. And I also feel old because all these generations are now in the mix that none of which are part of. So there you have it. No, I think that's such an important question, Chris. And I really, it's the hardest question we have to ask because there's so many schools right now that, are just, we've seen some schools close. I mean, a pandemic away from, or a crisis away from closing their doors. So I think schools really have to start thinking strategically about who they are, who they want to be in the future, and how they're going to get there. And I also think, and this may not be popular with everybody, but we are charging way too much money for boarding school, and it's not attainable for the vast majority of people, both internationally and domestically. So if schools want to, balance out their dependence on international locations or have more diversity in their international enrollments, and they want to attract more domestic day students, boarding students, domestic boarders, we got to fix this tuition crisis, because schools are, the smaller schools that don't have $400 million endowments and are not discounting tuition because they can discount with financial aid, need to really think about how to be competitive in a market where most people can't afford $65,000 a year to go to school. And that is just an absolute fact if you look at incomes in most regions in this country. So, and internationally. So how are we going to address that? Are schools willing to stop raising tuition? Are they willing to think about tuition in new ways? Are they willing to lower tuition? And I think those are conversations that are really going to have to happen. And when doing that, and if deciding to do that, know the reasons why you're doing it. Like, I really don't feel like a tuition we reset our day tuition last year. It was wildly successful. We doubled our applicants for the day market. And it had nothing to do with our program not being top notch, not being as good as every other program in the area, but it had to do with the fact that it was based in equity and inclusion, and how can we continue to make this so unaffordable for so many people and still claim to want to have socioeconomic diversity and global diversity. And that means so much to us as a mission, but we're just pricing ourselves out of the market. So if you look at the percent, the 2% a year for the next 5 years, some schools are going to be almost $80,000. So in our incomes. So in the last 10 years, boarding school tuitions have increased by 50%. And I would venture to guess that people's salaries have not increased by that much, at least not across the board. So we need to think about this. That would be my biggest call to action.
I mean, we could probably have a whole episode roundtable on this discussion. Maybe we will, because, I was thinking the other day to myself, would I have had the same opportunity, now? Tuition is 3 times what it was when I was a student. And I think there's a conversation we're going to be having as a nation, depending on the political climate, as what is the next steps in education. You have a insurmountable student loan debt when it comes to higher education. Now, to your point, independent schools have stayed on track with tuition rates with upper education or higher education. And so I think that will be a factor in the next 10, 20 years of how people look at education. How are they getting that education? And are we, kind companies ask themselves this all the time. Are we pricing ourselves outside the market? Right.
Yep.
You know, are we doing that as independent schools as well? And so, I mean, I love that response and that honesty, because I think that is, if we want to look at ourselves in the mirror, we got to have this conversation in the next 10 years. Otherwise, you know, who knows what we're going to find ourselves in. And I think the schools that do actually ask themselves that will be in a better position to offer those services. I mean, you've also seen a huge growth, I think, in the last, not to get on a tangent, Jesse, so I do apologize, but you've seen a lot of growth in the last 20, 30 years in development and building, putting investors back into the school. So it's not like that money went somewhere other back into the institution, but you've got to ask yourself, you know, at the end of the day, you know, are we not achieving our mission as an institution because of our tuition prices?
Right.
And I think that's the hard question we've got to ask ourselves.
Well, and I think also just how, with all the things we're seeing now with students, I mean, I interviewed a kid the other day who I asked how remote learning was going. Oh, I love this so much. I would do that. You know, I don't know why she's applying. She should probably find a place that's going to be online for her high school, because she is just thriving. And I'm thinking, there are going to, you know, not only are there other options, there's charter schools, there's magnet schools. Well, now there are going to be a lot of virtual options that families might just say, this worked really well for my kid. Maybe not overwhelmingly, maybe not most kids loved it, but there are some kids out there that they really liked this, and they can go pay, you know, $18,000 a year to do a great online program. I don't know if that's a price, but, you know, it could be.
It's not 50.
It's not 70 or 80.
Yeah.
And you know, and they can still get this great education, and they're popping up everywhere, these online programs, you know, some better than others probably, but every time we have another option in the market, we got to be ready to change or adapt, right?
And I think that the conversation started, you know, already, you know, especially when you look at, you know, like NACE had in their trend book most recently talking about millennials and Gen Xers. You know, our income's lower, and I speak our because it's us. You know, we're the next generation of parents, and you know, our debt is already so high. Our ability to pay those tuitions are just not there. And, you know, if there was some way to rethink tuition or financial aid on the reverse side, you know, it can work both ways. You know, you would have these types of families get more invested in the schools. They would want these opportunities. I went to private school. My entire life is based off of promoting private schools and advocating for independent schools. I know what it did for me. I know what it's done for other young adolescents as well. That should be an option for them. But, you know, going back to your point too, one of the best things that I learned when I was on the road was how unique each school is. You know, when you went out there, before you get involved with all of these other schools, you know, you just think that, hey, your private school, college preparatory, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But then you go in there and they have a marine biology program. Yours has an equestrian program. Mm-hmm. They have science-based, they are math-based, they have athletics, and they, you know, in even soccer, volleyball, like they all have different niches, you know, that they're filling. Focusing on those more, you know, we'll be able to separate and add some value to you know, your institution that might not have been, you know, you might have been relying on, it's the US, you can get into college here. Mm-hmm. You know, that's not going to be able to be relied on anymore. I mean, you're going to have to really draw them in for something, because there are, like you said, a lot more options. So that financial component and you know, focusing on what they are. I'm glad the conversation started. I'm going to be interested to see how some of the solutions that pop up over the next few years, because you know, where this might have been you know, 5-10 years down the road with COVID, you know, we you know, you've seen with the trends that happened after the financial crisis. There's years after that you're going to start feeling the effects, especially with independent school tuition. About the ability of parents to pay. Those solutions might need to start coming a little bit sooner to try to keep that enrollment up.
I think it happens pretty quickly here. And, you know, you make a great point when you're talking about like online type schools, right? You know, when a university looks at a application, right, and the school has both a in-person and online option, they're not going to know which one they took. Right. And so all it takes is a few schools to say, this is an avenue of revenue. We're going to charge 25% of the market, you know, bring these students in, maybe have some in-person sessions or maybe not. But, that changes the whole game at that point, right? And so it's going to be very interesting to see how schools adapt in the next few years.
Exactly.
All right, last question. Got to hear from you. Where do you see the biggest opportunity coming from?
Wow.
Or in general, where do you find some opportunity coming from? Where do you see that coming on the other end?
I mean, I feel like we have an opportunity. I think schools right now, and I think some of this has to do with what I'm talking about with tuition resetting and thinking of new ways to promote programs and thinking of adding things like the remote option. I think the biggest opportunity here is for schools. It's a wake-up call for schools of all sizes, of all endowments, of all, histories and length of time being open. I think it's a wake-up call to say, what do we continue to do that we've done for 150 years, and what do we need to do to be around for another 150 years? Because it's not the exact same thing. And I think there's opportunity in that. Believe me, this is not the year I signed up for. This is not in 20 years of admission, 21 years of admissions. This is the hardest year I've ever worked in a school, ever, because things are so unpredictable and so up in the air. But if we don't take this as an opportunity to, reinvent some of the things that we've been doing because it's just worked for so long, we know it's not going to. And I think this has really given schools the push that some may have needed to say, what should we be doing different? What did we learn that we can keep? What did we, what do we have to get rid of, or what do we have to do to move forward and be attractive to these new generations of consumers? I think it's critical. So, and there's so many more things I could say about that.
Yeah.
I think another opportunity we have as schools that has nothing to do with COVID, but kind of started happening at the same time as COVID, is really addressing the racial injustice and equity and diversity in these schools, and why is it taking so long for schools to do this and really understand that we have to have faculty and staff that reflect the cultures and backgrounds of their students, and we really need to listen to these students. I think that's something I would just feel remiss if I didn't mention is a huge opportunity for schools right now that kind of came in the summer. It's been in existence forever, but in the summer kind of really bubbled up to the surface for a lot of reasons, and I think we have an opportunity. And frankly, an obligation to address these issues in schools. So those would be my two cents.
No, that's huge. I mean, once again, every time we bring you on to ask a question, we've got a whole nother show's worth of content that we could talk about. That's those are big issues, and you're absolutely right. Even some schools that were already doing that, had to jump it to another level, and that all happened over this summer. So you're right, and great points. I really appreciate all the insight that you've given, and it's been quite a bit. I think that anyone that watched the show today is going to leave with some great knowledge. So I really appreciate you coming on. It was a great show. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Kristen. I really appreciate it. Have a great rest of the week. Happy Thanksgiving to you as well.
Happy Thanksgiving. It's great to see you, and thank you guys so much for having me.
See you guys.
Take care.
Well, that'll do it for us this week. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next week.